The CIA's Berlin Tunnel operation emerged from the unstable geopolitical reality of post-war Germany, where Berlin stood as an exposed Western enclave deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, and functioned as both a symbolic prize and an intelligence battleground from the moment the Cold War hardened after 1945, and by the early 1950s, the city had become a dense concentration of military headquarters, communications hubs, and occupation authorities whose daily radio and landline traffic offered a rare window into Soviet intentions if it could be accessed, a problem that preoccupied American and British intelligence as the Korean War intensified fears of surprise attack in Europe and revealed how limited Western insight remained into Soviet operational planning, force readiness, and command doctrine, particularly in East Germany, where large Soviet formations were permanently stationed. And it was within this atmosphere of urgency that American intelligence officers began to explore unconventional technical means of interception, eventually converging on the idea of exploiting the fixed landline cables that connected Soviet headquarters in East Berlin to command centers throughout the German Democratic Republic, lines that were assumed to be secure precisely because they ran underground through territory firmly controlled by Soviet and East German authorities, a confidence that Western planners identified as a potential vulnerability rather than a safeguard, and after preliminary surveys confirmed that a critical trunk cable passed close to the American sector of Berlin, the CIA, in cooperation with British intelligence, authorized a clandestine engineering effort of unprecedented scale, one that required months of excavation beneath the border without detection, the careful construction of a reinforced tunnel large enough for personnel and recording equipment, and the installation of taps capable of capturing thousands of hours of unencrypted voice traffic, all while maintaining absolute secrecy from both the public and allied governments not directly involved, because discovery would risk diplomatic catastrophe in an already volatile city, where the memory of the Berlin blockade remained fresh, and where any perceived provocation could be interpreted as preparation for renewed confrontation. And construction began in 1954 under the cover of a supposed warehouse project in the American sector. With excavation teams working at night, soil quietly removed and dispersed, and engineers forced to solve problems of groundwater seepage, structural stability, and signal integrity in confined conditions that allowed no margin for error, since even a minor collapse or surface disturbance might alert East German security patrols. And when the tunnel finally reached its target after several hundred meters, technicians installed a sophisticated array of inductive taps and amplifiers designed to siphon off conversations without interrupting service. A crucial requirement because any degradation in signal quality could prompt inspections that would expose the operation, and once activated, the tunnel began delivering a steady stream of intercepted communications that revealed an extraordinary volume of Soviet military and administrative activity, including routine logistics reports, personnel movements, training schedules, and candid discussions between officers who assumed their lines were secure, providing Western analysts with a granular picture of Soviet forces in East Germany that far exceeded anything previously available. And for a time, the operation appeared to justify every risk taken, as analysts pieced together order of battle data, assessed readiness levels, and gained insight into command relationships that informed NATO planning during a period when fears of a sudden armored thrust into Western Europe were taken seriously. Yet, from its earliest days, the operation carried a hidden flaw that would ultimately undermine its value because unknown to the CIA and British intelligence at the time of planning. A senior officer within British intelligence had already passed details of the project to Soviet intelligence, ensuring that Moscow was aware of the tunnel before it ever became operational. A reality that transformed the tunnel from a secret weapon into a controlled channel through which the Soviets could decide what information to expose. And while Western services remained unaware of this compromise, Soviet counterintelligence adopted a calculated response, allowing the tunnel to function for nearly a year rather than immediately shutting it down, a decision rooted in the desire to protect the source of their foreknowledge while simultaneously exploiting the opportunity to manage Western perceptions. And during this period, Soviet communications continued to flow through the tapped cables, some of them genuine and operationally mundane, others carefully curated to mislead or to reveal information already deemed expendable, creating a complex intelligence picture in which authentic insights and deliberate noise were inseparably intertwined. And this ambiguity went unrecognized in Washington and London, where the sheer volume of intercepted material reinforced confidence in the operation's success and encouraged further investment in technical collection methods, until April 1956, when East German authorities abruptly announced the discovery of an underground tunnel in East Berlin, presenting it as evidence of Western espionage, and staging a public exposure that included guided tours for journalists, photographs of the tunnel's interior, and official protests accusing the United States of violating sovereignty and international norms. A revelation that embarrassed Western governments and forced them to manage the political fallout while carefully avoiding disclosures that would confirm the operation's true scope. And although the Soviets publicly condemned the tunnel as an aggressive act, their restrained response reflected the fact that its existence had long been known to them, and that its continued operation had already served their counterintelligence objectives. While within Western intelligence circles, the exposure prompted an internal reckoning over operational security, inter-service coordination, and the inherent risks of large-scale technical espionage in contested environments. Lessons that would shape subsequent approaches to signals intelligence during the later Cold War, particularly the emphasis on redundancy, compartmentation, and skepticism toward sources that appeared too productive to be true. And in the broader historical context, the Berlin Tunnel operation illustrated both the ingenuity and vulnerability of Cold War intelligence work, demonstrating how technological ambition could deliver unprecedented access while remaining fatally dependent on human trust and secrecy, and how in the shadowed struggle between superpowers, even the most elaborate clandestine achievements could be neutralized by a single breach, leaving behind an intelligence windfall whose true value could never be fully disentangled from the deception that surrounded it. A legacy that underscored the paradox at the heart of Cold War espionage, where success and failure often coexisted, indistinguishable until long after the cables went silent and the tunnel itself became a relic of a city permanently shaped by division. In the months following the public exposure of the tunnel in April 1956, Western intelligence agencies were forced into a prolonged period of quiet reassessment that unfolded largely out of public view, because while the immediate diplomatic fallout could be managed through routine protest and denial, the deeper implications of the operation's compromise struck at the credibility of technical intelligence collection during a phase of the Cold War when policymakers increasingly depended on it for strategic warning. And within the CIA, the first priority was to reconstruct the internal history of the project in meticulous detail, tracing every stage of planning, authorization, construction, and operation in order to determine whether the exposure had resulted from technical failure, procedural sloppiness, or deliberate betrayal, a task complicated by the compartmented nature of the program, which meant that no single office had a complete picture of how information had flowed between American and British partners, contractors, and field officers. And as analysts began reviewing the intercepted material itself with a more critical eye, questions emerged that had previously gone unasked, particularly regarding the unusually high volume of candid Soviet communications and the apparent absence of sensitive operational surprises that might have been expected if the tunnel had truly penetrated the heart of Soviet command security. And these doubts were sharpened by the realization that the Soviets had not reacted to the tunnel's existence in a manner consistent with genuine surprise, instead allowing it to operate for months before orchestrating a theatrical discovery that emphasized propaganda value over immediate countermeasures, a pattern that suggested foreknowledge and deliberate timing rather than sudden detection. And while suspicions about a possible internal leak circulated quietly, the identity of the source remained unknown, forcing Western services to confront the uncomfortable reality that some of the intelligence derived from the tunnel might have been filtered or manipulated at the source, a possibility that undermined confidence in assessments of Soviet force readiness and intentions drawn from the material during 1955 and early 1956, and this uncertainty coincided with a broader strategic transition within the Cold War, as the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 and the subsequent power consolidation under Nikita Khrushchev introduced new variables into Soviet policy that Western analysts struggled to interpret, particularly as Moscow began emphasizing missile development and political pressure tactics over the massive conventional offensives that had dominated earlier threat models, meaning that intelligence gaps created by doubt over the tunnel's reliability had to be filled through alternative sources at precisely the moment when the strategic environment was becoming more complex. And within NATO planning circles, the episode reinforced existing anxieties about Berlin's vulnerability, because the tunnel had been conceived as a means of compensating for the West's exposed position in the city, and its compromise underscored how fragile that advantage truly was in the face of Soviet counterintelligence reach, leading to renewed emphasis on dispersal, redundancy, and the integration of signals intelligence with aerial reconnaissance and human reporting, rather than reliance on any single collection method. And although public attention quickly moved on, the tunnel's legacy persisted within classified doctrine, shaping debates over the balance between technical audacity and operational prudence. Debates that intensified as the CIA and its partners expanded their global interception efforts in the late 1950s, often in regions where the political consequences of exposure would be even more severe than in divided Berlin. And as internal inquiries continued, the eventual revelation that the project had been compromised from its inception by a trusted British intelligence officer confirmed the most damaging suspicions and forced a painful reckoning within the Anglo-American intelligence relationship. Because while cooperation remained essential, the tunnel episode demonstrated how shared operations magnified the consequences of individual betrayal, prompting reforms aimed at tightening access controls, improving counterintelligence vetting, and limiting the dissemination of sensitive operational details, even among close allies. And beyond these institutional lessons, the Berlin tunnel operation also influenced Soviet behavior, reinforcing their confidence in counterintelligence penetration and validating their strategy of selective exposure, in which allowing an adversary limited access could be more advantageous than total denial. A lesson that would recur throughout the Cold War as both sides increasingly treated intelligence not merely as a means of discovering facts, but as a tool for shaping perceptions. And in the specific context of Berlin, the tunnel's exposure became another episode in a long sequence of confrontations that kept the city at the center of superpower rivalry, contributing to an atmosphere of mutual suspicion that hardened attitudes on both sides and reduced the space for compromise as the decade progressed, even though the operation itself had ended. And for historians, the challenge of evaluating its true impact has remained persistent, because disentangling genuine intelligence gains from deliberate Soviet leakage is inherently difficult. Yet what can be established with confidence is that the tunnel represented a turning point in Cold War espionage, marking the moment when large-scale technical collection reached a level of ambition that made its failure as instructive as its success. And by exposing the limits of secrecy in a world saturated with informants and countermeasures, it forced intelligence services to confront the paradox that greater technical sophistication often required greater trust in human systems that were inherently fallible, a paradox that would continue to shape intelligence operations long after the physical tunnel beneath Berlin had been sealed and forgotten by the city above, even as its consequences quietly informed decisions made far from the ground, where engineers once worked in silence beneath a divided capital. As the implications of the tunnel's compromise settled into the strategic consciousness of Western intelligence, attention shifted toward managing the longer-term consequences for intelligence credibility and for Berlin itself, a city whose political symbolism far exceeded its physical size, and whose divided status made every clandestine operation there an implicit test of resolve. And within the CIA, the episode accelerated an internal shift away from singular, high-risk collection projects toward more layered intelligence architectures that could absorb compromise without collapsing entirely, a shift reflected in increased investment in aerial reconnaissance platforms, early satellite concepts, and dispersed listening posts across Allied territory, all designed to reduce dependence on any one source whose loss might distort strategic assessments. And this diversification was driven not only by the tunnel's exposure, but by a growing recognition that Soviet counterintelligence had matured into a disciplined and patient apparatus capable of exploiting Western eagerness for insight, particularly when that eagerness encouraged overconfidence in the apparent productivity of a source, and in parallel British intelligence undertook its own reassessment, one complicated by the need to confront the internal betrayal that had enabled the Soviets to control the tunnel operation from the outset, an episode that deepened institutional caution and contributed to a more guarded approach toward joint technical ventures. Even as political leaders continued to emphasize the necessity of close Anglo-American cooperation in the face of perceived Soviet expansion, and beyond intelligence agencies, the tunnel incident subtly influenced diplomatic calculations surrounding Berlin, reinforcing the perception that the city was an arena where actions taken below the threshold of open confrontation could nonetheless carry strategic weight, a perception that informed subsequent Western responses to Soviet pressure tactics, including restrictions on access routes and administrative harassment designed to test resolve without triggering outright conflict. And while the tunnel itself did not directly cause these pressures, it formed part of a cumulative pattern of clandestine maneuvering that convinced both sides that Berlin was a place where advantage could be gained through persistence and psychological pressure rather than decisive military action. And for the Soviets, the controlled exposure of the tunnel validated an approach to counterintelligence that balanced secrecy with manipulation, demonstrating that allowing an adversary to believe they possessed a privileged window into intentions could shape that adversary's planning in predictable ways, particularly if the information revealed emphasized stability and routine rather than imminent threat, a strategy that complemented broader Soviet efforts during the mid-1950s to project an image of strategic restraint while consolidating control within the Eastern Bloc. And this interplay between intelligence collection and perception management became increasingly pronounced as both superpowers entered a phase of the Cold War characterized by competing narratives of deterrence and coexistence. Narratives that depended heavily on assumptions about the other side's intentions and capabilities. Assumptions often derived from intelligence sources whose reliability could never be fully assured. And within this environment, the Berlin Tunnel operation came to be viewed less as an isolated failure and more as a case study in the structural vulnerabilities of intelligence work under conditions of ideological confrontation, where secrecy was absolute, stakes were existential, and the margin for misinterpretation was narrow, and the tunnel's legacy was therefore felt not in immediate policy reversals, but in the gradual recalibration of how intelligence was weighed alongside diplomatic signals, military deployments, and political rhetoric. A recalibration that encouraged caution in drawing firm conclusions from any single stream of information, and in the historical record, the operation also highlights the asymmetry between effort and outcome that characterized much of the Cold War, because the immense resources devoted to constructing and operating the tunnel yielded insights whose ultimate value remains contested. While the act of exposure itself served Soviet propaganda and counterintelligence aims more clearly than it damaged Western strategic position, reinforcing a sense among intelligence professionals that success could not be measured solely by access or volume, but by the ability to discern authenticity amid deception. And as Berlin moved toward the later crises of the decade, including escalating disputes over access and sovereignty, the tunnel episode faded from public memory, even as its lessons persisted within classified training and doctrine, shaping how future generations of intelligence officers understood the relationship between technical innovation and human vulnerability. And by the time the city again became the focal point of global attention in the early 1960s, the subterranean struggle represented by the tunnel had already influenced the mental frameworks through which policymakers interpreted events, contributing to a cautious appreciation of how easily apparent advantage could be undermined by unseen compromise. And in this way, the Berlin Tunnel operation occupies a distinctive place in Cold War history, not as a decisive turning point, but as a revealing episode that exposed the fragile foundations upon which intelligence certainty was often built. Foundations that would continue to be tested as the Cold War evolved into a more technologically complex and psychologically intricate contest. Long after the physical traces of the tunnel had been erased beneath a city that remained, above ground, a symbol of division and unresolved rivalry. In the years immediately following the tunnel's exposure, the intelligence environment in Europe entered a ibadio phase of consolidation rather than escalation, and this context shaped how the operation was ultimately absorbed into Cold War practice. Because despite the embarrassment and internal damage it caused, it did not provoke a direct crisis or retaliatory action that altered the balance of power, allowing both sides to quietly incorporate its lessons without public reckoning. And for Western intelligence services, the most enduring consequence was a recalibration of expectations about what technical interception could realistically deliver in a landscape saturated with counterintelligence. A recalibration that became evident in the cautious language of internal estimates produced in the late 1950s, which increasingly emphasized probability, confidence levels, and corroboration rather than definitive conclusions drawn from single-source material, reflecting an institutional memory shaped by the tunnel's deceptive productivity. And this shift coincided with broader developments in intelligence methodology, as advances in electronics and data processing encouraged larger-scale collection while simultaneously amplifying the risk that volume could mask manipulation, a risk the tunnel had embodied in its most extreme form. And within this evolving framework, Berlin remained a central laboratory for intelligence experimentation, not because it offered easy victories, but because its divided status ensured a constant flow of observable interactions, administrative disputes, and security incidents that could be analyzed without reliance on deeply penetrated sources, reducing the incentive to repeat operations of comparable audacity to the tunnel. And for the Soviets, the episode reinforced confidence in their ability to manage Western intelligence penetration without resorting to blunt denial, a confidence that encouraged a more nuanced approach to information control, particularly in communication security, where incremental improvements were paired with selective transparency designed to signal stability or restraint when advantageous. And this dual approach reflected a sophisticated understanding of intelligence as a reciprocal process in which adversary perceptions could be shaped as effectively as they could be observed, an understanding that matured during the late 1950s as the Cold War shifted away from immediate post-war uncertainties toward more institutionalized forms of rivalry, and as memories of the tunnel receded from public discourse. Its influence persisted in training curricula and internal histories that framed it as a cautionary example of how technical brilliance could be neutralized by human compromise, reinforcing a professional culture that treated counterintelligence not as a supporting function, but as a central pillar of operational success. And this emphasis proved consequential as intelligence services confronted new challenges in other theaters, where the temptation to replicate the tunnel's scale and ambition arose repeatedly, but was often tempered by the recognition that the cost of exposure could outweigh the value of access, particularly in politically sensitive environments where discovery might trigger open confrontation. And within the broader Cold War narrative, the tunnel's story also illustrates the asymmetry between secrecy and disclosure, because while the operation itself remained classified in many of its details for decades, the fact of its existence entered public consciousness through Soviet-managed exposure, shaping popular understanding of espionage in ways that emphasized Western intrusion rather than the deeper reality of mutual surveillance. A framing that served Soviet political objectives at the time and complicated Western efforts to contextualize intelligence activity as a routine aspect of superpower competition rather than an exceptional provocation. And this asymmetry underscores how intelligence operations could reverberate beyond their immediate tactical outcomes, influencing diplomatic narratives and public perceptions long after their operational relevance had faded. And for historians reconstructing the episode, the gradual declassification of records has revealed a layered story in which technical ingenuity, bureaucratic momentum, alliance politics, and personal betrayal intersected, producing an outcome that defied simple categorization as success or failure. Because while the tunnel did provide authentic insights into Soviet administrative routines, its compromise rendered those insights perpetually suspect, forcing analysts to treat them as illustrative rather than authoritative, a distinction that became increasingly important as Cold War decision-making relied on comparative analysis rather than absolute certainty. And in this sense, the tunnel contributed to a broader intellectual shift within intelligence analysis, away from the pursuit of complete knowledge toward the management of uncertainty, a shift that aligned with the strategic realities of deterrence, where miscalculation posed existential risks and restraint depended on conservative interpretation of incomplete information. And as the Cold War progressed into more technologically complex phases, the memory of the Berlin Tunnel operation continued to exert a quiet influence, reminding practitioners that the most elaborate clandestine systems remained vulnerable to the simplest human failures, and that adversaries who appeared passive might in fact be shaping outcomes through patience and selective disclosure, a lesson that retained relevance far beyond Berlin and beyond the specific historical moment that produced the tunnel. And although the physical structure had long since been dismantled and the city above it transformed, The operation's legacy endured in the professional consciousness of intelligence services as a benchmark against which new proposals were measured, not as a model to be emulated, but as a boundary case that defined the limits of acceptable risk. And in this way, the Berlin Tunnel operation occupies a distinctive place in Cold War history as an episode whose significance lay less in what it revealed than in what it taught about the nature of secrecy, trust, and deception in a divided world. Lessons that continued to shape intelligence practice even as the geopolitical landscape evolved, and the subterranean struggle beneath Berlin became a closed chapter in a conflict defined by unseen contests and carefully managed perceptions. By the early 1960s, as Berlin once again moved toward the center of Cold War confrontation, the Berlin Tunnel operation had already passed into the realm of internal precedent rather than active reference, yet its influence could be detected in the restrained manner with which intelligence services approached the renewed crises surrounding access, sovereignty, and military posture, because the tunnel had demonstrated that clandestine advantage in Berlin was rarely decisive and often accompanied by long-term strategic cost, a realization that tempered enthusiasm for spectacular covert initiatives at a moment when miscalculation carried the risk of escalation between nuclear-armed powers. And within Western intelligence culture, this restraint manifested as a preference for distributed collection systems that emphasized persistence over penetration, favoring signals gathered from multiple peripheral points, Allied territory, and later space-based platforms, rather than concentrated access deep inside adversary-controlled zones, an approach that reflected hard-earned skepticism born from the tunnel's ambiguous returns. And while this evolution owed much to technological progress, it was also shaped by institutional memory, as senior officials who had witnessed the tunnel's life cycle carried its lessons into decision-making roles, reinforcing a cautious ethos that prioritized survivability and deniability over dramatic gains. And for the Soviets, the episode reinforced their assessment that intelligence confrontation in Berlin could be managed without resorting to overt force, encouraging continued reliance on counterintelligence penetration and controlled exposure as tools to shape Western behavior, an assessment that aligned with broader Soviet strategy during this period, which sought to test Western resolve incrementally while avoiding actions that might unify adversaries or justify military response. And in this environment, the tunnel's story became part of a larger pattern in which intelligence operations were increasingly understood as instruments of influence as much as discovery, shaping expectations, reinforcing assumptions, and subtly constraining policy options through the information they appeared to provide. And this recognition contributed to a more sophisticated analytical culture on both sides, one that acknowledged deception as an integral component of intelligence rather than an aberration, and for historians, examining the Cold War's subterranean dimensions. The Berlin Tunnel operation thus serves as a prism through which broader themes can be observed, including the tension between technical ambition and human vulnerability, the fragility of alliance trust under the strain of secrecy, and the difficulty of translating clandestine access into reliable strategic advantage. Themes that recur across decades of intelligence history, but are rarely illustrated as starkly as they are in this case, because the tunnel combined extraordinary engineering achievement with total operational compromise, producing a record that is simultaneously impressive and cautionary, and as archival material has gradually clarified the extent of the operation's betrayal. Its meaning has shifted away from earlier celebratory narratives toward a more sober appraisal that emphasizes process over outcome, focusing on how decisions were made, how risks were assessed, and how institutional momentum can sustain projects even when their underlying assumptions are flawed. And this appraisal resonates beyond intelligence history, offering insight into the broader Cold War condition, in which vast resources were often committed under conditions of uncertainty, driven by fear of surprise and the perceived necessity of acting before the adversary did. And within this context, the Berlin Tunnel operation stands as an example of how the pressure to reduce uncertainty can paradoxically increase it, when the very mechanisms designed to illuminate intentions become channels for distortion, a paradox that intelligence services would continue to grapple with throughout the Cold War and beyond. And although the tunnel did not precipitate a direct crisis, its indirect effects on analytical discipline, operational caution, and alliance management were real and enduring, shaping a generation of practitioners who internalized its lessons, even as the world moved on to new technologies and new arenas of competition. And in the final assessment, the Berlin Tunnel operation is best understood not as a singular failure or success, but as a revealing episode that encapsulated the contradictions of Cold War espionage, where secrecy was both shield and vulnerability. Access was inseparable from deception, and certainty remained elusive despite unprecedented effort, leaving behind a legacy defined less by the information it collected than by the discipline it imposed on those who sought to collect information in a divided and distrustful world. In retrospect, the closing significance of the Berlin Tunnel operation lies in how quietly it reshaped assumptions rather than policies, because unlike crises that forced visible decisions or public realignments, the tunnel worked its influence through institutional memory, professional caution, and a recalibrated understanding of what intelligence could and could not reliably provide. And as the Cold War matured into a long-term condition, rather than a temporary emergency, these subtler forms of influence became increasingly important, shaping the internal cultures of intelligence organizations that would operate for decades under conditions of permanent rivalry. And within this environment, the tunnel became a reference point invoked not for its technical ingenuity alone, but for the way it illustrated the limits of clandestine certainty, reminding analysts and operators alike that access did not equal truth, and that even the most ambitious collection systems remained vulnerable to manipulation by an adversary willing to exercise patience and discipline. And this recognition contributed to a gradual shift in how intelligence was integrated into strategic decision-making, reinforcing the idea that intelligence should inform policy without dictating it, and that ambiguity was an inherent feature of the international system, rather than a temporary flaw to be eliminated through greater effort, a perspective that aligned with the logic of deterrence, where stability depended less on perfect knowledge than on conservative interpretation and restraint. And as Cold War institutions solidified, the tunnel's story continued to circulate in classified histories and professional training as an example of how quickly advantage could turn into liability when secrecy was breached, reinforcing a norm of skepticism that became a defining feature of mature intelligence analysis. And beyond its institutional impact, the operation also left a mark on historical understanding of the Cold War itself, because it exemplified the degree to which the conflict was fought below the surface, through invisible struggles over information, perception, and trust that rarely entered public consciousness, yet exerted a powerful influence on how states assessed risk and responded to uncertainty. And in this sense, the Berlin Tunnel operation stands alongside other formative episodes of early Cold War espionage as a reminder that the contest between the superpowers was not only a competition of armies and ideologies, but a continuous negotiation over knowledge itself, in which each side sought to reduce its own uncertainty while increasing that of the other, often with mixed and ambiguous results. And although the tunnel has since been reduced to a historical footnote outside specialist circles, its deeper implications remain relevant for understanding how intelligence shaped the Cold War's trajectory, not by delivering definitive answers, but by framing the questions policymakers believed were most urgent, and by imposing a discipline that recognized the dangers of overconfidence in a world where deception was routine and verification incomplete. And as the Cold War eventually drew to a close, the lessons embedded in episodes like the Berlin Tunnel operation endured beyond the conflict that produced them, influencing how intelligence services approached new adversaries and new technologies under similarly opaque conditions, demonstrating that the fundamental challenges of secrecy, trust, and interpretation were not unique to a divided Berlin, but intrinsic to intelligence work itself. And in this final view, the tunnel can be understood as both a product of its time and a warning that transcended it, illustrating how the pursuit of certainty under conditions of fear and rivalry can generate its own forms of vulnerability, and how the true measure of intelligence success often lies not in dramatic access or technical achievement, but in the humility to recognize the limits of what can be known, a recognition forged beneath the streets of Berlin during one of the Cold War's most ambitious and compromised clandestine operations.